Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, context is everything. Media Network, founder and CEO, John Michael, is reading a textbook, cover to cover. Today, we're just about there. We're really almost done with this book. Chapter 35, Section 4, Middle East and the World, setting the scene. To David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, the birth of modern Israel in 1948 was the fulfillment of God's promise to the ancient Israelites. He quoted, "The land whereto we have returned to inherit it. It is the inheritance of our fathers, and within it no stranger has part or parcel. We have taken unto us our father's inheritance." First book of Maccabees. But the Arabs then living on the land called Palestine in creation of Israel claimed that the creation of Israel was an illegal invasion, in quotation marks. Why is it in quotation marks? Don't quite understand. The land, they felt, was rightfully theirs. "Palestine is the homeland of the Arab Palestinian people. It is an indivisible part of the Arab homeland, and the Palestinian people are the integral part of the Arab nation." Palestine National Charter, Article 1. These conflicting claims to the same land touched off repeated violence. The Arab-Israeli struggle was one of many issues that focused worldwide attention on the Middle East. I find it interesting that they're using biblical scripture as evidence here, where in the rest of the book, that is not valid source material for, logical claims to things. In this case, it is a logical claim to the land. A little bit, New heading. The Cold War and after. Today, as in the past, the Middle East was a strategic region. It commands vital oil resources as well as key waterways such as the Bosporus, the Suez Canal, and the Persian Gulf. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union were anxious to have access to the oil and waterways. Superpower rivalries had a far-reaching impact on the region. Superpower rivalries. In their global rivalry, each of the superpowers tried to line up allies in the Middle East. The United States sent aid to stop a communist threat to Turkey in 1947. For years, it supported the strongly anti-communist Shah of Iran, despite his repressive actions. In Egypt, Nasser saw himself as the leader of the non-aligned movement. Nasser. Gamal Abdel Nasser, 1918 to 1917, military, both army and allied. Why doesn't it just tell me who he is? Whatever. He's a guy, and he's important, and here's more about him. In Egypt, Nasser saw himself as the leader of the non-aligned movement. Still, the Soviets showered aid on Egypt during the Nasser years. Iraq, Syria, and Libya also became Soviet client states, dependent on the support of a stronger power. All of these Arab nations mistrusted their former colonial rulers in the West and condemned Western support for Israel. Weapons pile up. Such superpower sold arms to its allies in the region. In the Arab-Israeli conflict, the United States helped Israel, while the Soviet Union gave aid to the Arabs. After each Arab-Israeli war, the superpowers rearmed their allies with expensive new weapons. Other nations also benefited from lavish arms sales, including such valued American allies as oil-rich Saudi Arabia. Are we still technically allies with them? I'm not sure. I think they did something recently in 2023 that meant that we're not as closely tied as we used to be. That's a good moment to say, I'm almost done with this book. I'm almost done with the book, right? So for you subscribers and for you prospective subscribers, I'm going to be doing modern news. Just things that are in the news. Like, you'll see it. It'll be on the screen, like right over here. Right over here, you'll have like a news item, and like a clip will play, and then I'll say, see the clip? That's what's happening. That happened just yesterday. And I'll do that once a week, and I'm almost done with this book, so that's going to be immediately after this book is done. With the context of having just read a world history textbook, I'll be speaking on today's history that's being made as we experience it. During and after the Cold War, the development of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East became a global concern. They were using that word already. Interesting. This book was copyright 2001, before 9/11. So they're using the word weapons of mass destruction before 2001 tragedy. Oh, today is 9/11, by the way. 2023. Just complete happenstance. Weapons of mass destruction. I did not expect that. I thought that was like a word that they made up to make it sound really bad. It was something that would sound really bad when George W. Bush said it. Weapons of mass destruction. Like a new word, so people could be extra scared. But no, it existed before that. International military experts believe that Israel was developing nuclear weapons to defend itself against hostile Arab neighbors. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, was also thought to be building a nuclear capability, as well as stockpiling chemicals and biological weapons. Iraq used some of its poison gas supplies to suppress a Kurdish liberation movement within its own borders. Arab-Israeli conflict. New heading. After 1948 war, Israel and its Arab neighbors fought again in 1956 and 1967 and 1973. In these conflicts, Israel defeated Arab attacks and gained territory. In between the wars, Israel faced guerrilla warfare and terrorist activity. Despite the long conflict, the UN, the United States, and others kept pushing for peace negotiations. The occupied territories. In the 1967 war, Israeli forces won the Golan Heights from Syria, East Jerusalem and the West Bank from Jordan and the Gaza Strip, and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. In 1973, Arab attacked Israel but failed again to regain these occupied territories. Israel refused to give up on the territories until Arab nations recognized Israel's right to exist. Later, Israel annexed East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. The government helped Jewish settlers build homes in occupied territories, displacing more Palestinian Arabs. Palestinian resistance. The number of Palestinians in refugee camps had grown since 1948. Many supported the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, headed by Yasser Arafat. I think he's dead. Its stated goal was destruction of Israel, which the PLO claimed had not had no right to exist. For years, the PLO waged guerrilla war against Israelis at home and abroad. Bombings, airplane hijackings, and massacre of Israeli athletes in the 1972 Olympics brought the PLO demands to the attention of the world. At the same time, though, such attacks stiffened Israel's resolve not to negotiate with the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization. In 1987, young Palestinians mounted the Intifada, or uprising, against Israeli occupation. They stoned Israeli troops and disobeyed curfew laws. The tough Israeli crackdown on the violence deepened division within Israel. Some Israelis were willing to give up the occupied territories in exchange for peace. Others remained determined to keep and settle the lands they had won. Peace efforts. During the Cold War, efforts to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict had little success. However, as you have read, Anwar Sadat did take a courageous first step. Who is Anwar Sadat? I'm not sure who that is. As part of the 1979 peace treaty, Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 further helped the peace process. Without Soviet aid, some Arab governments accepted the need to negotiate with Israel. In 1994, Jordan and Israel signed a peace agreement. Talks between Israel and Syria, though, stalled on the issue of Golan Heights. The status of Jerusalem was another thorny issue. After annexing East Jerusalem, Israel claimed the entire city as its undivided capital. Arabs insisted that the status of Jerusalem, a holy city to Muslims, Jews, and Christians, must be part of any final peace agreement. Historic accord. In 1993, Israel and the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, held direct talks for the first time. Arafat, the Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, signed the Oslo Accord based on secret discussions held earlier in Oslo, Norway. The Oslo Accord gave Palestinians Gaza and the West Bank city of Jericho limited self-rule. The Oslo Accord gave Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, the city of Jericho, limited self-rule. The following year, a new pact further extended Palestinian self-rule. The accords raised hopes, but peace would not come quickly. A bloody conflict, which has been raging for 100 years, warned Rabin, can only be resolved by means of a process, not a stopwatch. Continuing issues. Some Palestinians were dissatisfied because the agreement did not promise them an independent homeland. The region became heavily dependent on Israel. Still, the accord established an independent Palestinian Authority, headed by Arafat, to rule part of the occupied territories. In return, authority promised to end the terrorist activity against Israel. The Palestinian Authority faced other challenges, such as building a government from scratch and securing economic aid. Many Israelis bitterly criticized the peace accords. They distrusted Arafat, who in the past had worked to destroy Israel. In 1995, Rabin was killed by Jewish students who opposed his policies. Rabin's successor, Benjamin Netanyahu, was a critic of Rabin's peace policies. Under his administration, the peace process slowed, and Jewish settlements in the occupied territories expanded. Radical Palestinian groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah also opposed the peace process. They denounced Arafat as a puppet of Israel and launched new bombings on other attacks. Under these pressures, Arafat announced his readiness to make a unilateral or one-sided declaration of Palestinian independence if further progress did not come quickly. What? Arafat announced his readiness to make a unilateral or one-sided declaration of Palestinian independence if further progress did not come quickly. Independence? I thought they wanted land. I thought they were independent but wanted land. Or they... What? Palestine. I'm missing something. Radical Palestinian, already said that. In 1998, the United States President, Bill Clinton, brought Arafat and Netanyahu together and brokered the Wye River Accords. The agreement was intended to put the peace process back on track by scheduling further withdrawals of Israeli troops from disputed lands. Prospects for the future. Arafat pushed steadily for a timetable for complete Israeli withdrawal. In 1999, a new Israeli prime minister, Ehud Barak, replaced Netanyahu. What? Like Rabin, Barak was a former B-A-R-A-K, was a former general determined to achieve peace. He proposed new timetable for Israeli withdrawal and negotiation of other thorny issues. Netanyahu, is he still in power? Netanyahu, is he still the prime minister? Because it says that he wasn't. Netanyahu. Let's see. So he was the prime minister from 1996 to 1999, and again from 2009 to 2021. Okay. So, Bibi, nickname, Bibi. Civil War in Lebanon. In the 1970s, the Arab-Israeli conflict fueled tensions in nearby Lebanon. After winning independence, Lebanon became a thriving center of international commerce. People of diverse ethnic and religious groups lived in mostly harmony. But the surface prosperity masked deep problems. Growing tensions. The government depended on delicate balance among Maronites, a Christian sect, Sunni and Shiite Muslims, Druzi, a sect derived from Islam, and others. Maronites held most power, but local bosses controlled their own districts backed by private armies. A growing number of Palestinian refugees crossed the border from occupied territories into Lebanon. Their needs strained resources. Also, the Muslim population began to outnumber Maronites, creating unrest. Adding to the tensions, the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, developed into an important force in the Palestinian refugee camps. From Lebanon, PLO guerrillas crossed into Israel and attacked civilian and military targets. To end the threat to its security, Israel tried to influence events in southern Lebanon. Years of violence. In 1975, Lebanon was plunged into a seemingly endless civil war. Christian and Muslim militias, bands of citizen soldiers, battled for control of villages and Beirut, the capital city. Israel invaded the south to clear out PLO bases and advanced almost as far as Beirut. Syria occupied eastern Lebanon. Lawlessness led to massacres on all sides. As Palestinian refugee camps came under fire, thousands were killed. A UN peacekeeping force tried to restore order, but it withdrew after hundreds of French and American peacekeepers were killed in a series of suicide bombings. Rebuilding. By 1990, Lebanese leaders finally restored some measure of order. The PLO was forced out of southern Lebanon. Private armies began to disarm, and the ruined capital slowly rebuilt. Over the following decade, the economic outlook improved, and many Lebanese who had fled their homeland returned. By 2001, Beirut was poised to return to its former status as a leading economic center of the Middle East. Despite the hopeful outlook, divisions remained. Syria was still a dominant presence, and Israel forces continued to take military action against suspected terrorists in southern Lebanon. The future of this small nation seemed to depend on the prospects for peace among its neighbors. New heading and final heading. Two wars of the Persian Gulf. Border disputes, oil wealth, foreign intervention, and ambitious rulers fed tensions along the Persian Gulf. In 1980, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein seized the disputed border region from Iran. Iraqi forces then pushed deeper into Iran, which was embroiled in its recent Islamic revolution. Before long, Iranians launched a counterattack. They urged young soldiers to spread their revolution to Iraq. Iraq used its superior weapons, tanks, airplanes, and even poison gas to stop waves of Iranian soldiers. Fighting threatened to spread as both sides attacked international tankers and offshore oil fields in the Persian Gulf. The United States sent naval forces to protect shipping lanes in the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. The war dragged on for 8 years, ending in a stalemate for both nations. The human and economic toll was enormous. A second Gulf War. In 1990, Iraqi troops invaded both oil-rich nation of Kuwait. In 1990, troops invaded the oil-rich nation of Kuwait. Saddam Hussein argued that historically the region was part of Iraq. Control of Kuwait would give Iraq not only its world's largest oil-producing area, but also access to the Persian Gulf. The United States saw the invasion as a threat to its ally, Saudi Arabia, as well as to oil flow from Persian Gulf. President George Bush therefore organized a coalition of American, European, and Arab powers to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. In 1991, Gulf War American missiles and bombers destroyed targets in Iraq. Then, under the UN banner, coalition forces pushed across the desert to liberate Kuwait. As they retreated, Iraqi troops blew up hundreds of Kuwaiti oil wells. Unresolved issues. Though defeated and diplomatically isolated, Saddam Hussein held onto power in Iraq. Right after the war, he brutally suppressed revolts by Kurds and Shiites who had suffered under his rule. To protect these minorities, the UN enforced no-fly zones, areas over which Iraqi aircrafts were not permitted to fly. For years after the war, UN economic sanctions kept Iraq from selling oil on the world market and from importing most goods. The goal was to force Saddam Hussein to stop his chemical and nuclear weapons programs. Iraqis suffered severely from the sanctions, but the government generally failed to cooperate with UN weapons monitors. The government generally failed to cooperate with UN weapons monitors. In the late 1990s, the UN set up an oil for food program to help Iraqi people. It allowed Iraq to sell some oil on the world market and to use the profits to buy food and medicine. Still, the standard of living in Iraq fell, setting off an international debate. Some people called for an end to the economic sanctions, which they argued were hurting ordinary Iraqis far more than it was hurting the government. Others argued that lifting sanctions would reward Saddam Hussein. They insisted that he was still trying to rebuild weapons of mass destruction. Looking ahead. That means end of chapter. By the year 2000, the Middle East remained the focus of many conflicting forces. Nationalist conflicts clashed between religious and secular goals, and competition for water resources were among many forces that carried a potential for future violence. And the area's vast surplus of oil guaranteed that outside powers would continue to intervene in the region. Right. At the same time, the region's resources and increasingly educated population could provide the foundation for a peaceful, prosperous future. Much depended on ending warfare that had torn the Middle East apart for half a century. Did not happen. Did not happen. Is it worse off now than it was in 2001, the Middle East? Quite possible. God bless.